People often assume fear comes from sharpness. If a blade can shave hair, slice paper, or glide through flesh like a modern scalpel, that must be terrifying. By that logic, medieval swords should feel crude, thick, uneven, dull compared to the surgical precision of modern knives. And yet, for centuries, the appearance of a medieval sword on a battlefield inspired a kind of fear that modern weapons rarely evoke on a human level. Not because it was sharper, but because it was built to do something far more brutal. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Medieval swords were not designed to cut the way modern knives do. They were designed to break bodies. This is where the first illusion collapses. A modern kitchen knife is optimized for slicing soft materials, meat without resistance, vegetables without armor, controlled cuts in safe environments. Medieval swords, on the other hand, evolved inside chaos: mud, blood, armor, bone, shields, adrenaline, panic. Their job was not elegance. Their job was certainty. That difference changes everything. The typical medieval sword blade was thicker, heavier, and less refined at the edge. Not because blacksmiths lacked skill. Medieval metallurgy was far more advanced than pop culture admits, but because razor sharpness was actually a liability. A blade sharpened like a modern knife chips easily. It dulls fast. It fails when it meets metal, bone, or hardened leather. Medieval swords expected to hit those things. Instead of relying on a thin edge to slice cleanly, they relied on mass, momentum, and geometry. When a long sword struck, it didn't politely open flesh. It transferred kinetic energy deep into the body. Bones cracked. Joints collapsed. Helmets rang. Even when armor wasn't pierced, the body inside absorbed the trauma. A cut didn't have to be clean to be lethal. This leads to the central question we rarely ask. If medieval swords weren't especially sharp, why were they so devastating? And why are we still afraid of them today? The answer begins with how humans misunderstand violence when it's too clean. Modern tools teach us to associate danger with precision. Surgeons cut millimeters from arteries. Factory blades slice steel sheets with exact tolerances. Clean equals effective. Messy equals primitive. Medieval warfare rejected that assumption entirely. A medieval sword was part weapon, part blunt force instrument. Its edge bit, yes, but its true power came from how it carried force. A strike to the shoulder could dislocate it through padding. A blow to the skull could concuss or kill without ever breaking skin. A hit to the forearm could shatter bone even if the blade didn't cut through. Pain was immediate. Damage was irreversible. Survival often meant permanent injury. And unlike modern knives, medieval swords were used in prolonged encounters. Not a single cut in a sterile environment, but repeated impacts while exhausted, terrified, and surrounded by screaming men trying to do the same thing to you. Fear compounds when pain is not instant death, but slow collapse. Another illusion falls apart here, the idea that medieval weapons were unsophisticated. In reality, sword design represented a careful balance between edge retention, flexibility, shock absorption, and durability. A sword that was too hard would snap. Too soft, and it would bend uselessly. The edge had to survive repeated impacts against armor, shields, and other swords. That meant sacrificing razor sharpness for reliability under abuse. A slightly dull edge that still works after 10 strikes is deadlier than a razor edge that fails after 1. This design philosophy explains why medieval swords still feel threatening when we see them today. Even hanging on a wall, they radiate a different kind of intent. Not surgical, not delicate. Purpose-built for human destruction at close range. There is no distance, no abstraction, no button to press, just weight, motion, and flesh. Modern knives are terrifying because of how cleanly they cut. Medieval swords are terrifying because of what they promise to do even when they don't cut cleanly. They remind us of something deeply unsettling. that violence does not require perfection, only force applied with intent. And this is only the surface, because once we move beyond sharpness, we uncover a deeper reason medieval swords remain so frightening. They were designed for armored humans, not unprotected ones, and that changed how killing worked entirely. In the next part, we'll dismantle another myth, the belief that armor made medieval warriors safer, and uncover why swords became instruments of controlled devastation rather than simple blades. Armor is supposed to make you safe. That is the modern instinct. We imagine steel plates as protection, shields as reassurance, and thickness as security. From that perspective, medieval armor looks like progress, a solution to the problem of sharp blades. If swords weren't razor-sharp, surely armor neutralized them. This assumption is catastrophically wrong. Medieval armor did not remove fear, it redefined it. Once armor became widespread, swords were no longer expected to slice exposed flesh. They were expected to defeat a protected human body. And that forced a radical shift in how violence was engineered. Instead of asking, "How do I cut skin?" medieval weapon design asked a darker question. How do I destroy what's inside the armor? This is where medieval swords become truly unsettling. Plate armor was incredibly effective at stopping cuts. Even a sharp blade would often glance off steel or bite shallowly into hardened leather. But armor could not eliminate physics. Energy still had to go somewhere. And it went into bones, joints, organs, and the brain. A sword strike to a helmet didn't need to penetrate to be fatal. The sudden acceleration of the skull could cause concussion, brain swelling, or instant unconsciousness. A blow to the chest could rupture organs through padded layers. A hit to the arm could shatter bone, even if the armor remained intact. Medieval combat understood trauma long before modern medicine named it. This explains why swords evolved away from pure cutting tools and toward hybrid instruments. The edge still mattered, but it shared importance with mass distribution, balance, and stiffness. The blade became a delivery system for force. That's also why many sword techniques didn't involve cutting at all. Half-swording, gripping the blade with one hand, allowed fighters to use the sword like a spear, driving the point into gaps in armor. The pommel became a hammer. The crossguard became a hook. The sword transformed from blade to leverage device. This adaptability is what makes medieval swords so frightening in retrospect. They were not single-purpose tools. They were systems. Against an armored opponent, the goal was rarely a clean kill. It was incapacitation. Knock them down, break a limb, stun them long enough to finish the job. Fear came not from instant death, but from the realization that once you fell, you were helpless. And falling was easy. Armor was heavy. Heat built quickly. Fatigue arrived faster than panic. One misstep, one stumble, one solid impact, and the fight was over. Here's the part modern audiences often miss. Medieval swords weren't fighting untrained victims. They were fighting other swords, trained men, and layers of protection. That required a weapon that could endure chaos. A modern knife excels in controlled environments. A medieval sword thrived in disorder. That difference explains why sharpness was intentionally limited. A slightly thicker edge spreads impact over a wider area, reducing chipping and increasing durability. The blade flexes, absorbs shock, and returns to shape. It survives collisions that would destroy a razor-thin edge. Durability meant persistence. Persistence meant dominance. This also changes how we interpret medieval violence psychologically. Modern violence often feels distant. We talk about calibers, ranges, efficiency. Medieval violence was intimate. You heard breathing through a helmet. You felt resistance in the blade. You watched your opponent weaken slowly. Fear didn't come from the weapon alone. It came from certainty. A medieval sword didn't promise a quick end. It promised that once contact was made, damage would accumulate. Even if you survived the first strike, you were not safe from the next. That lingering threat is why medieval swords still unsettle us today. They remind us that technology doesn't need to be precise to be effective. It needs to be appropriate to its environment. Medieval swords were terrifying not because they were crude, but because they were perfectly adapted to human bodies under stress. And yet, there is one final misunderstanding left to dismantle. If medieval swords relied on force rather than sharpness, why did they continue to inspire reverence, ritual, and symbolism long after their battlefield relevance faded? The answer lies not in mechanics, but in meaning. In the final part, we'll explore why medieval swords became symbols of authority, justice, and fear itself, and why, even today, they feel more personal than any modern blade. Even after firearms began to dominate battlefields, the sword refused to disappear. That alone should trouble us. Once a weapon is no longer the most efficient way to kill, history usually discards it without sentiment. Spears vanished, maces faded, crossbows became curiosities, but swords lingered in ceremonies, in courts, in myths, in symbols of power. Why? Because medieval swords were never just tools of violence, they were instruments of judgment. This is the final reason they remain so frightening. A gun kills from a distance, a knife kills quietly, but a sword kills in full view, with time, motion, and unmistakable intent. It demands that the wielder commit, physically and morally, to the act. That made the sword uniquely suited to represent authority. In medieval societies, swords were inseparable from justice. Executions were carried out by sword, not because it was easy, but because it was visible. The crowd saw the raised blade, the arc of motion, the moment of impact. Power was not hidden. It was displayed. A duller blade did not weaken that symbolism, it reinforced it. The execution sword was often heavier, broader, and deliberately optimized for a single decisive blow through bone and muscle. Sharp enough to cut, yes, but above all, capable of delivering overwhelming force. Failure was unacceptable. Hesitation was unthinkable. The fear came not from sharpness, but from finality. This same logic extended to knighthood. When a sword touched a shoulder in a knighting ceremony, it was not a harmless prop. It was a reminder. The same object that grants authority can revoke life. Honor and violence shared the same edge. Modern weapons lack this duality. A firearm is anonymous. A missile is abstract. Even modern knives are utilitarian. The medieval sword, however, sits at the intersection of craftsmanship, violence, and meaning. It carries history in its weight. This is why replicas still unsettle us. When we hold a medieval sword, we don't imagine paper being cut. We imagine bodies. Armor, resistance, struggle. The sword asks us to picture who it was meant for. And that is uncomfortable, because medieval swords reveal a truth we prefer to forget. Effectiveness in violence is not about refinement. It is about suitability. The sword was not optimized for neat wounds. It was optimized for human conflict as it actually existed. Messy, exhausting, relentless. This is also why comparing medieval swords to modern knives misses the point entirely. A modern knife exists in a world of safety standards, sterile environments, and controlled use. A medieval sword existed in a world where survival depended on ending a threat decisively, even through armor, fear, and fatigue. Sharpness was optional. Dominance was not. So when we ask why medieval swords are still frightening despite lacking modern sharpness, the answer becomes clear. They were never designed to impress the eye. They were designed to overwhelm the body, and to remind everyone watching that power, once raised, cannot be taken lightly. That lesson has not dulled with time.